Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center. I'm Claire Haley. I'm our Vice President of Author Talks and Democracy Initiatives here at the History Center. We are so excited to welcome you all tonight. Thank you for coming out on a Wednesday evening. We really appreciate it. Tonight, we will be discussing George Black's new book, The Long Reckoning, a story of war, peace, and redemption in Vietnam. If you have not yet purchased your copy of the book, they are available for sale out in the lobby for 25% off this evening. And as a bonus, George and Chuck Searcy, one of the people featured in the book, will be around to sign them after the event as well. So we'd really appreciate that. If you remember from earlier, we will have time for questions. So if you have a question, just wait for the mic to get to you at the end of the event, and we'll make sure that George and Chuck are able to hear those from you. And I'm going to briefly introduce tonight's guests, bring them out, and then we will get started. So George Black is tonight's featured author. He's a writer and journalist based in New York City. He's the author of 7 previous books examining varied topics, including anything from Chinese democracy to conflicts in Central America to the 19th century American West. And of course, including tonight's topic, the war in Vietnam and the aftermath. He's written a lot for Longform Magazine and other publications, including the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker. He's worked with the BBC, PBS, NPR. You've probably seen his work around, so we're really excited for George to be here tonight. He's going to be joined in conversation with Chuck Searcy. Chuck is a Vietnam War veteran. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1966, served in the 519th Military Intelligence Battalion in Saigon from 1967 to 1968. He's had quite the career after his time in the Army. He's done a little bit of everything, working both domestically and internationally, working in Vietnam. He's a University of Georgia graduate, which we have quite a few of those in the room tonight. And he also worked, again, with lots of Vietnam veteran associations, including on the legacies of unexploded munitions in Vietnam. So we're very excited to hear from him this evening. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming George Black and Chuck Searcy. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Atlanta History Center. Thank you all for coming. I love doing book talks, but this one is a little bit better than the usual because of Chuck being here with me, which is a great privilege and a pleasure. He is very much one of the central, if not the central character in the book. And he's a Georgia boy with more Georgia experience than you could spend the next half hour talking about. So let me start by talking a little bit for a few minutes about the basic idea of the book, how it started, what the motivations were for writing it, why I think in some ways it is different from other books that have been done. And there have been, according to one account or estimate, 30,000 books on the war in Vietnam. So you feel a little intimidated writing another one. But I tried to make this one something different. I think it goes back, you know, it's always interesting as a writer to examine your motivations, why you do a particular project. And I think a lot of that is explained by the title of this book. It's actually taken from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1808 to the young Republicans of Pittsburgh. And he said, "The evils of war are great in their endurance, and they have a long reckoning for ages to come." I grew up in the UK in the 50s and 60s. My grandfather was incapacitated, bedridden for his whole life by being gassed in the trenches in World War I. My parents, through the 50s, had ration cards from World War II. When we moved from Scotland to London, our South London neighborhood was full, all the way through the 60s, of bomb sites. You know, you'd see the sides of buildings hanging off with a fireplace in midair. And they still hadn't repaired it. So I think in a sense that was kind of an interesting childhood influence that comes back to me a lot. And then I grew up in the era where if I'd been an American, I would have been drafted. I had one American friend in high school. He was on the basketball team with me. I was the captain. Of course, being an American, he was a way better basketball player than I was. And all of a sudden, one day, Jack was gone. And he was off to Vietnam. And he did not survive. I think he survived for about 6 weeks. So that was with me always. And then in later life through my career, I've worked in and about a lot of societies emerging from war, or in one way or another scarred by war. I cut my teeth as a journalist in the early 80s during the Central American Wars. I was just down in El Salvador last month for the first time in many years, and that country has never recovered from its war. Its particular problem was that none of the people guilty of war crimes was ever punished. They never had a meaningful judicial system. They had no accountability. And the result of that was, a massive exodus of refugees because of the violence, followed by the incubation of gangs like MS-13 in California, who were then expelled back to Salvador, where there was no justice system. So they, these cycles of war repeat and repeat and repeat. In Iraq, what was the consequence? The country was essentially handed over to Iran. Wars have long, and often unexpected and certainly unanticipated consequences. So one other interesting thing about writing a book like this is when you look at the first reviews that come in, and you realize that it's a kind of Rashomon process where every reviewer comes at a book from his or her own perspective, what they know or believe about the subject already. And the reviews have been very good. We've had the front page of the Washington Post Book World. We've got a fabulous review this week in the New York Times book review. But they're all different. It's very interesting. Some people see it as a story of veterans. Some see it as a story about Agent Orange. Some see it as a story that's a familiar story about the terrible war and the things that went wrong. And what I tried to do in the book really goes back to the early history and the stages, excuse me, the stages through which the story took shape. Most of you, I'm sure, probably have a general sense of the geography. Vietnam, long, skinny, S-shaped country, Cambodia, Laos, then Thailand on one side, China up to the east. But this is not a book about the whole of Vietnam. This is a book about a very particular area of Vietnam. And it began to take shape both as a story, a narrative, but also as an idea, as a thesis, through the first trips I made, which were in 2014, 2015. And I asked around because I wanted to find a veteran who was resident in Vietnam and was doing work concerned with post-war reconstruction, reconciliation, and immediately, the unanimous advice was seek out this guy, Chuck Searcy. And hold this, I'll come back to the map while I'm talking because it's important to reorient yourself. But these are the two provinces immediately south of the old demilitarized zone. And then the Lao border and the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail that comes down right along the border. And these dotted lines are the trails that were coming in from Laos in 1968, mainly at the time of the Tet Offensive. And that is primarily where I met and got to know Chuck, who was a handsome young blade in Saigon during the Tet Offensive and fresh out of the training that Claire described. And the first thing we got to know each other over was the work that he and Vietnamese partners were doing in the province of Quang Tri, which is immediately south of the demilitarized zone. And it's fundamentally to remove unexploded ordnance from the war, which is everything from gigantic artillery shells down to hand grenades, and particularly cluster munitions, which are very indiscriminate. They are these big pods that contain hundreds of bombs that then shoot out the size of baseballs. Kids think they're playthings. And they've accounted for huge numbers of deaths and casualties. And the organization that Chuck founded, jointly with a Vietnamese colleague, Hoang Nam, who we'll talk about in a minute, set about in 2001 forming this organization, partnering with others to remove unexploded ordnance and make the province safe for farmers, for kids, for ordinary people working in their fields. This is at the famous rock pile, which is one of those words that if you're an ex-Marine kind of still gives you shivers. It was right on the front line by the DMZ. And this was a cache of explosives that was discovered by members of Chuck's team, Project Renew, at the base of the rock pile. One of his important Vietnamese colleagues is this now very good friend, Phu Nguyen, who is visiting here a scrapyard. This was either on my first or second trip, and there were many more scrapyards in those days than there are now. But here is, you know, a typical scrapyard full of the detritus of war. Phu grew up right on the DMZ, on the famous McNamara line, and his childhood was going out with his dad to the old bases, scavenging scrap metal, and often unexploded scrap metal, and learning to be careful, having to be warned by his dad what to touch and what not to touch. There are fewer of these now. This was probably 9 years ago. But nonetheless, this sustained the industry of Quang Tri province, the economy in the very poor post-war years for many, many years. And in the neighboring areas of Laos, which I'll come on to, it still does. It still does. The town of Dong Ha, where Project Renew is based, was really in a way, the sort of epicenter of all of the destruction, the physical destruction that occurred during the war, during the Tet Offensive, and then even more importantly, during a 1972 offensive where the People's Army of Vietnam, which we often call the NVA, came surging across the demilitarized zone and obliterated. It was basically a huge conventional war between tanks and artillery and aerial bombing, B-52s, offshore shelling, and it reduced the town of Dong Ha, where Project Renew is based, to rubble. The irony of this is, and this goes to the first of the questions about what people think they know, what the received wisdom is about the war. If you ask people, you know, who was responsible for the victory of the Vietnamese, the North Vietnam government, people would tend to say Ho Chi Minh, because he's a big symbolic nationalist leader, very important, very inspirational. He lost his real influence over the Communist Party of Vietnam very early in the war. This is Ho Chi Minh visiting Moscow in 1956 to the Soviet Party Congress, and to his right, this side, is a man called Le Duan. Le Duan was a hardline Stalinist and essentially the most influential member of the Vietnamese Politburo, and in terms of day-to-day decisions, much more influential by the time the war really stepped up than Ho Chi Minh. And he was the great advocate of large-scale military offensives that would trigger an uprising. And the irony of that is that he was opposed in this often by Ho Chi Minh and by the figure on the left of this photograph, who was the great military genius, General Giap, who was responsible for the great military victory over the French in Vietnam in 1954. Giap was also largely sidelined in the planning of the big offensives in 68, Tet, and then in 72, when the primary result was a huge offensive against Le Duan's own hometown. Dong Ha, which we saw in ruins, was Le Duan's town, and it was wiped off the face of the earth, and so was most of that province, which is one of the great ironies of the war. Le Duan here is with, General Giap here is with General Nguyen Chi Thanh, who is the other five-star general, very close political associate of Le Duan's, very much of a hardliner. And this is the two of them really in a propaganda photograph trying to show that they were collaborating with each other, examining plans for the Tet Offensive. On my second trip to Vietnam, I sort of branched out a little bit, traveled a bit more from Quang Tri, and met the second major veteran character in the book, who is center-right Manus Campbell. Manus had a very opposite war experience. Chuck can talk about his own, but Manus was really a kid, a 19-year-old, thrown into combat with the Marines as a grunt. He was an infantryman, rifleman in the area where my book is set, and witnessed and experienced some of the really most horrific passages of the war in that area, and suffered as a result for many, many years through his experiences, in particular a very traumatic initial firefight, first time he killed a man, first time he really saw a mass death, struggled with a very, very bad case of PTSD. And PTSD, through Manus's story, after the unexploded ordnance story, became sort of the second strand in this tale of the multiple long-term legacies of the war. Manus went back to Vietnam considerably later than Chuck did. He first resettled there in 2010, and his motivation was to help the kids. He had turned by that time very heavily toward Buddhism. He became a devotee of the great Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, and he settled in the city of Hue and found a Buddhist school for disabled children, largely children with all sorts of disabilities, but many of whom were presumed to be victims of Agent Orange. And so the third theme then that emerged after unexploded ordnance, after PTSD, was Agent Orange, which is really the big one in many ways, and probably the most familiar at this point to a lot of American audiences. A lot of the book is about Agent Orange, but just as I try to make a thesis that you can understand the alternative reading of the war by focusing on this small area defined by the DMZ, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the politics of General Secretary Le Duan. The story of Agent Orange, I think, also is one that, for many people, if not most, there's sort of a received wisdom about what happened. You know, American veterans were treated shamefully for many, many years because they could not get governmental recognition for the reasons why so many of them were falling sick. So many cases of cancer, so many children born with birth defects. And then in the Agent Orange Act of 1991, that was sort of made right, not because the science was clear, and this is something I go into in quite a lot of detail in the book. The science about the causal connection between exposure to dioxin, the toxic component of Agent Orange, and this range of diseases is ultimately unprovable. If you get prostate cancer or type 2 diabetes or many other things, you cannot prove scientifically that it was because of Agent Orange. What you have is what they call a presumptive service association, which is actually a very generous, it's more of a sort of a moral, political recognition than it is a scientific one, because it says essentially, if you were in Vietnam during those years and you have one of these conditions, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And that benefit of the doubt was never extended to the Vietnamese. And worse than that to me, and I think in a way this is one of the most important parts of the book to me, the Vietnamese scientists very early on in the war, way before the Americans were seeing this, were seeing veterans coming back to the north from the battlefronts of the south and suffering horrendous levels of cancer and giving birth to kids with birth defects. And Vietnamese scientists plugged away at trying to understand the reasons for this for many, many years. And they were written off as propagandists. You know, this was extortion, this was an attempt to get corporate liability against the producers, it was propaganda. And the Vietnamese who did the early science, going right back to 1970, this is really the father of that whole school of scientists, Dr. Ton Tat Tung, who was a world-renowned liver specialist. I mean, this guy was publishing in The Lancet, which is one of the two great medical journals in the world, with the New England Journal of Medicine, in the early 60s, writing about liver disease, writing about liver surgery. And he's documenting all these cases, he's doing longitudinal studies of veterans, and he's written off as a propagandist. And from him, you go through a series of other very distinguished Vietnamese scientists. This is Dr. Nguyen Tuan, who was an OBGYN, married to a Vietnamese general. She became an acolyte of Dr. Tung, and then through the next couple of generations, it passed to the head of the government agency studying these things. Dr. Huang Ning Cao, and his companion and deputy, Dr. Lei Kao Dai. Very, very distinguished people, and they had seen this stuff up close and studied it. And I think one of the messages, without going into more detail, is, I think it's really nothing less of than shocking that these people were just written off as, communist propagandists. They were deeply serious people, and they knew what they were talking about. So Agent Orange is another strand, and then we bring in the international support for work on Agent Orange, which again is done in exactly the same small geographical area where Lei Kao Dai, Huang Ning Cao, these other scientists had done a lot of their work. And it's this very notorious place in the history of the war that every veteran, if you hear the name, it causes shudders, the A Shau Valley, where Hamburger Hill was. And this is a team of Canadian scientists who came in to work with the government committee that was headed by Drs. Huang Ning Cao and Lei Kao Dai. And in that there is a lesson, and it's a lesson that applies to Chuck's work and the work of others who worked on unexploded ordnance. Other characters I'll mention in a minute in the book. Take your lead from the Vietnamese. I think if some of you look at the book or buy and read the book, the most important sentence in the book to me is actually the last sentence in the prologue. The prologue is just a brief portrait of a Vietnamese woman growing up in Quang Tri with a couple of disabled children, and for many years after the war, she never sees an American, and then one day in the 1990s, a group of American veterans comes to the village. And the last line after they've listened to the stories of the villagers is, "What do you need and what can we do to help?" And I think that's the central message of all of the people that I write about in the book. They are American characters, and in this case, Canadian characters. This is one of the leading field scientists for the Canadian team who came in to do this study over a 4 or 5 year period. But that was always the way. This was not a Hatfield, that was the name of the company from Canada. It was not a Hatfield study. It was a Hatfield 1080 committee study. That was the Vietnamese group that gave the lead. And another of my main characters, a woman called Lady Borton, who is a very close associate and friend of Chuck's. She came out of the Quaker tradition. She ran the Hanoi office of an organization called the American Friends Service Committee, came from a long line of Quakers in her family. And she has a proverb, Vietnamese proverb, that she likes to quote, which is, "When you enter a family, follow its practices. When you enter a river, follow its flow." And that's what the Hatfield team and the Project Renew team did. These are villagers, ethnic minority villagers, in that valley, the A Shau Valley, collecting fish to be sampled for dioxin. This is a local woman of the Katu minority people being persuaded very reluctantly to give blood. These people believe in a spirit world which controls all human affairs, and the idea of giving blood initially was anathema to them. They were very, very afraid to do it. But in the end, what they gave the scientists to analyze really proved not how individual cases of illness were connected to Agent Orange, but how the thing worked. From the airplanes to the soil, to the water, into the fish, into the human body, into the blood, into the breast milk. The breast milk being the worst of it, because dioxin collects in fatty tissue. And breast milk and the breast in general is a major site of fatty tissues. The dioxin concentrates there. And it's the only way the human body can actually get rid of dioxin is by expelling it through breast milk. So it's going into the next generation. And this was kind of the light bulb moment, this study. And after it, the American government really could not go on denying what had happened, and to some degree their responsibility for it. And it's in Laos too. Another character in my book in the center, well, both of these women are in the book. They come out of this same Quaker-based tradition. And 3 chapters of the book are devoted to Laos, just across the border, because one of the great secrets of the war is that Laos was also heavily sprayed with Agent Orange. That was a deep, deep secret. And they have done a tremendous amount of work to expose that and also to map the health effects. This is a 2-year-old. We spent 9 days together traveling down the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the Laos side of the border. This kid probably has hydrocephalus, which is an indicator of dioxin exposure. But the last part of the story really is, I mean, where I think policy and science lead to a political and moral insight, which is very important. People talk about Agent Orange victims. If you see the Ken Burns series or any time there's anything on TV about Vietnam, about Agent Orange, you know, the planes go over, they spray the fields, the kids are horribly deformed, here's an orphanage, and now they're all happy and smiling. And it's a very simplistic idea, the Agent Orange victim. Another very important character in my book who worked to finance a lot of the work that was done by the Canadian scientists in the 1080 Committee is a man Chuck and I know well, Charles Bailey, who was the head of the Ford Foundation office in Hanoi and had the resources, because it's a very big, well-endowed foundation, had the resources to allow a lot of this scientific work to be done. And one outcome of that was finally, after many years of difficult negotiations, an agreement by the United States government to clean up the 2 big air bases that were the center of the Agent Orange campaign, decontaminate the soil. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars on this. And it's a wonderful thing to do. It's the right thing to do. But Charles, and really frankly most people who work on Agent Orange seriously, say that the really important issue is not that, it's to protect and aid the generation that we call victims. Susan Hammond the other day, the woman in the center of that photograph from Laos, was telling a story. She runs a program also in Quang Nam province in Vietnam, which is very close to Quang Tri. She was telling a story of visiting a household where the man with lower limb deformities as a result of Agent Orange exposure, is a bicycle repairman. And his legs were so uncomfortable to squat on the ground that he just couldn't go on working. So she said, "What do you need? And what can we do to help?" He said, "I want a red plastic chair." She said, "A red plastic chair?" He said, "Yeah, then I can sit up and I can do my work." She went and bought him a red plastic chair. It was 50,000 dong. It was $2. And the message of that, it doesn't take much. You know, there are families in Quang Tri province where Chuck's associates also work on Agent Orange victims, where $1,000 transforms a family's life completely. But there are also, Charles Bailey introduced me originally to this man who is an incredibly accomplished mouth painter, very, very seriously disabled by Agent Orange. And he's nobody's victim. And Charles's philosophy, and I think a lot of people's philosophy who work on this, is it is possible to transform people to realize their potential and not just have them be victims. Chow is nobody's victim. I mean, he's a feisty guy, he's a super painter, lovely man. And I think that's a message that, you know, a lot of people will say, "Oh, this book, you know," my wife read it and she said, "I really like the book. It's so depressing, you know, the destruction that was caused by the war." And I said, "You're right, but it's also, this group of people are an inspirational group of people, and they're showing what can be done. And it doesn't cost much. You know, the cost of all of the programs, the current 5-year program to support people with disabilities because related to Agent Orange in Vietnam is $65 million. And I don't want to sound cynical. I know it does sound cynical, but it's kind of it's a benchmark of what $65 million means. It's nothing in Congress. It's the cost in current dollars of one B-52 aircraft. I mean, this is not a lot of money, and it should not be a partisan issue. You know, this is humanitarian work. One of my great heroes in the story is Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, who just retired. And it's a bipartisan question for him. Okay, he's a Democrat, but we know veterans who partner. You know, there's one pair of veterans we know in Da Nang. One of them is a very liberal, leftist, anti-war and activist. The other is a Trump supporter. And they collaborate every year to take bicycles to the ethnic minority kids in the Ashore Valley. And I think that proves, this should not be about politics. I'll end with this one because this really, I think of my characters in this book as being a Venn diagram. You have the veterans, you have the women coming out of the humanitarian tradition, you have the scientists, you have the funder of the scientists, and they all sort of coalesce really around the figures of Chuck and of Lady Borton from the American Friends Service Committee. And this is the nearest I have to a photograph that shows the Venn diagram. On the far left is Grant Bruce, who was a member of the Canadian scientific team in the Ashaw Valley. Lady Borton is the tall lady in the center with her dear Vietnamese friend Phong, who has worked with her for decades. Chuck is standing on the right, second from the right, and these are Vietnamese military collaborators looking at a contaminated former military base and thinking about how to clean it up. And I will just leave with this one image, which is, to me, in a way, sort of politically the most important one of all. As I said, when Chuck began Project Renew, it was absolutely hand in hand with the man in the center of this photograph, Hoang Nam, who is a provincial People's Committee official. And on that first trip to Quang Tri in 2014, Chuck took me to visit the vast war graves cemetery on the DMZ. It's dedicated to the 33,000 Vietnamese who died on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it's a very, very moving place. It's sort of their version of Arlington. And this is a moment where a recent American ambassador to Vietnam, whom I admire very much, Dan Crittenbrink, went to the Quang Tri Chong Son Cemetery in 2019 to light incense to honor those who died with Hoang Nam. And I just find that a very symbolic and very moving image. So I will stop there. You will hear Chuck's version, which is much more authentic and informed than mine can be, but thanks.
I don't have a version. I mean, you've explained so much already. In fact, that's one of the remarkable things about George's book. I read the publisher's, what do they call it? The publisher's proof first.
Reader's copy, yeah.
Yeah, and I was just astonished because I thought, as a veteran of the war and a U.S. citizen who's been interested in Vietnam and involved for a number of years, I thought I knew a lot about Vietnam and about the war and about the consequences and the aftermath. And I learned a lot of new things from George's book. The research that George did and the outreach dealing with not just American veterans and U.S. citizens who are in Vietnam today, but very importantly, reaching out to the Vietnamese and really getting their story and having them share their experiences. It really is a remarkable book. So I really urge you to read it, get a copy and read it and pass it along. You may have seen some of the reviews, which are very, very positive, and they sort of admit that this is one of the significant books of the Vietnam era. So I really recommend it, and I think you'll learn a lot too. I really admire George's ability to embrace so many aspects of the war, because it was very complicated and very and devastating for the Vietnamese people. And I think Americans have gradually over the years come to understand better what really happened in Vietnam. I think veterans do. Maybe better than ordinary American citizens, but it's taken a long time to admit that what happened there and what we did there was really not only tragic, but devastating to the Vietnamese people and their families, and more than one generation. But also, when I left Vietnam in 1968, and when I came back to the U.S. and became involved in the anti-war movement, which did not please my parents very much, I can tell you that. But my father was a veteran in World War II, was a soldier in World War II. He was captured in the Battle of the Bulge and was a POW under the Germans for a while. So that, of course, shaped his thinking, and he was very dismayed, to say the least, that his son was no longer patriotic, no longer supporting the U.S. government, opposed to the war in Vietnam. And he asked me, what happened to you over there? Did they turn you into a communist? But that happened with a lot of families. But the gradual awareness of our generation and maybe subsequent generations about the massive tragedy of the war in Vietnam, I hope has helped to shape our view of politics and policy today. I was about to say, as when I was back in the U.S. With my service in the Army finished, I was watching the news in April 1975 when Saigon collapsed and the tanks rolled through the fence there at the presidential palace in Saigon, and I felt this huge sense of a relief. It almost brought me to tears because it was just this burden had been lifted. This tragic period in our history was now ended. It was over. It had been terrible, but mercifully it's now ended. We can go on with our lives. And if there's one benefit from this whole experience, it is that we will never let this happen again. I was so sure of that. But of course we know what's happened since then. We've had repeats again and again. And I think that's one reason that American veterans, to the extent that we stay involved, remain involved, because there's always that elusive hope that we can somehow change things, and we won't let this happen again. But there are a lot of forces working in the opposite direction, so it's not an easy challenge to meet. I think one of the most valuable experiences for me as a Vietnam veteran was that I learned never to trust the U.S. government or any government again. Show me the evidence, speak the truth, and then we can decide what's the best policy. But I'm not going to accept at face value anything that anybody in the government says. And I worked in the government myself for a while, and I always tried to maintain that, I think, healthy skepticism. But the situation today is very different. The U.S., I think, is quite proud of the fact that we now have a very friendly relationship with the Vietnamese government, with the Communist Party there, which is fairly indistinguishable from the government, but there are some differences. And the ordinary people in Vietnam. They like us, they admire us. It's kind of hard to explain, but it is true. And they want to be friends with us. They've never considered themselves really, they've never considered that we were their enemy. They thought we were misguided, we made mistakes. And, and they make it very clear that they think that was because of errors by the U.S. government, but not the American people. The American people finally saw that we were doing the wrong thing, and they forced the U.S. government to stop. So the Vietnamese people have great appreciation for the American people. And it's quite genuine. As George and anybody else, some of you have been to Vietnam and visited, and I suspect you have experienced the same thing. It truly is remarkable. I think there's probably a lot of comments and questions that you guys have, which might make this a little more entertaining than me droning on, so I'll stop.
Great, so we're just going to have a little set change here, and then we'll get to your questions. So my colleague, Bo, who's over here, is going to be the one bringing around the microphone. Great, and so if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and Bo's going to make his way over to you. But I'm just going to get a question going to get us started as he finds his first question. But as both of you alluded to, the book, so if you haven't yet read the book, I'm going to add to what's already been said. I highly encourage you to, even if you think you know a lot about the Vietnam War, you were in the war, or you have read a lot about it, the book is really unique. It's divided into the history of these particular bombing and defoliation campaigns, then about the immediate post-peace period, and then later about the renewal period. So there's a lot to dig into there. But something I found really interesting, I didn't know when I started reading it, is that the average age for draftees in Vietnam was significantly younger than the average age of draftees in World War II. It was close to, I think you said 20 for Vietnam veterans or Vietnam draftees. And in World War II, it was about 26. So I wonder if you can talk about how that experience of having such a younger generation going to war, that's something that's very difficult for me to imagine in my current generation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that age influenced people as they went into the war with such a different point in their lives.
I got to defer to Chuck on this one to start off with, because he was one of them. I mean, you were a little older, but not much.
I was slightly older, yeah. I mean, I'd had 2 years of college when I went into the Army. I had the second year was kind of a bad year scholastically, so that was one reason I went into the Army. And so that put me at about 20 or 21 when I'm my first year in the Army. And I was, in my unit, there were quite a few guys who were my age or slightly older. And then, of course, some of the career officers were older. Okay. But the draftees, we had a couple of guys who were 18, but most of us were older. But that was not true of the combat units. There were combat units were taking guys, as young as possible, as legally allowable, and they even stretched the parameters, as you know, with that awful program initiated by Secretary of Defense McNamara. I think it was called the 100,000 Project, where they waived all of the minimum requirements for drafting young men, and not women at the time, but young men who were deficient. They didn't have any of the basic qualifications required, including mental prowess. I don't remember exactly how they phrased it, but they were cannon fodder. And in World War II, I mentioned my father earlier, but when he went into the infantry, he was right at 30 years old. He was probably 29 or 30, and I think he was not the exception. But 18, 19, 20, even 21, having never left your hometown or your home state, that's a very malleable age, and you are. It could shape your life negatively the rest of your life if you're not careful. Although you don't have many guideposts to go on, and you're inundated daily with this propaganda through the military and the institutions. I remember when I left on June 16th, 1968, I got on the plane in Benoit Air Base, and as we took off, and once we had flown out of Vietnam waters and into international waters, which was announced by the captain of the plane, resulting in cheers from everybody on the plane, right? But once we settled down and realized we were actually going home, we're leaving this hellhole that we'd been in for a year, the flight attendant started passing out this slick, glossy booklet, and it was very nicely done, very professionally done. And the title of it was, "Why You Were in Vietnam." And then it went page after page with beautiful color photographs and GIs providing dental care to little kids in villages and helping with the plant agricultural crops. And you know, it was all the nicest, all the best things that we could possibly do through USAID or through other organizations. And by the end of the book, you knew what we had been there for and and all the good things we'd been doing, you know, and it was, so we were confused. I mean, there was a lot of confusion among that young group. It made a huge impact. And it led to later what we identified as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
But George has encountered the same thing with veterans. And
Yeah, I mean,
his
Manus
interview.
Campbell, the Marine in the book, Chuck's close friend. Manus was 19. One thing Chuck talked about the kind of generosity of spirit of the Vietnamese, which I always find visiting the homes of people who lost family members in the war or who have brought up kids disabled by the war, but in this case talking particularly about those who died. There's in the first of the photo inserts in the book, which are after page, for whoever's got a copy there, 116, the third spread, there are the portraits of 3 of the young men who died in the first big firefight that Manus Campbell was in Thua Thien province on a trail leading to the Ashore Valley. They're babies. You look at these pictures and they're like, if any of you have the book, pass it around, because I mean, I look at these pictures, it just breaks my heart every time. You know, Ernest Hinsley in the middle, he's 18, he looks like he's 12. Mm-hmm. And you go into the homes of Vietnamese families, and you know, the ritual there is that you have a family altar to your ancestors. And you go into whether it's the south or the north, whether it's, you know, you've got the portraits of their sons and brothers and nephews and whoever, and they're babies. They're all babies, you know, and in many cases as young or younger, you know, and it leads me to a thought, which is sort of a thought too many for the book, but when a lot of us have been talking recently about how, you know, one of the chapters in the book is called Unfinished Business, and one of the things it touches on is the continuing search for the Vietnamese war dead, who were literally 100 times more numerous, the number of MIAs in Vietnam as here. And you know, every one of those lives was precious. Every American who was lost and not recovered was precious. It was a humanitarian obligation to try to bring them back. Vietnam has 100 times as many. And the key is going to be to get Vietnam to accept that the Southern war dead didn't know any more about why they were fighting in most cases than the Marines who were in the Ashore Valley. You know, they were kids, they were conscripted. You go to their homes, they're babies too. So the other thing I'd say about particularly the Marines I know, and Manus is a very good case of this, you know, when you're 19 years old, there's so much roiling around inside you. There's adrenaline, there's testosterone, those are all things that come out big time in combat. And you want to be a hero. And in many cases, you want to be a hero to your father. Manus's father was very demanding, very critical. Nothing was ever good enough. Manus was a wimp. And he wanted to be a hero in his father's eyes. So you go into combat, you're in a firing hole, and the guy next to you is dismembered by a shell or has his legs blown off and dies, screaming for his mother. How does a 19-year-old deal with that? Well, the main way you deal with that is, first of all, just you freeze in total confusion, and then when it's over, you have survivor guilt, which is the classic nucleus of PTSD for combat veterans is survivor guilt. Why him and not me? And I think many, many veterans just never really get past that.
I think we have a question from the audience. Behind you. Behind you, ma'am.
Sorry. I was curious. I know you mentioned how the Vietnamese see it was more an American government thing as opposed to blaming the American people for some of the things that happened. I was curious as to how the Vietnam War is taught to school-age children, if you're aware of how it's presented to them in the classroom, if you have any insight into that, just out of curiosity.
I only have one response to that, based on many years ago when my wife and I were sitting in the kitchen talking to our daughter, and somehow Vietnam came up. It didn't often. As I look back, I sort of regret that I didn't talk more about Vietnam in my experience. But in this case, my stepdaughter, who was about 16 at the time, made some really way off, inane comment about Vietnam and about the war. And I said, where did you get that idea? That's just totally not correct. And even before I could explain it to her, she said, oh, well, that's what they taught us in school. And I said, well, tell me more about what you were taught in school. And she said, oh, I don't really remember. She said, there was not much. She said it was about a half a page in one of our books. And I said, well, what did it say? And she said, I don't know. It said the Vietnam War was a time of disruption in the U.S. and it was unpopular, and that's about all I remember. And so, I mean, that's sort of pitiful, you know, if that's the extent of what you learn about Vietnam. And I assume that may be true everywhere. I don't know. But I also felt sort of bad that I didn't spend more time with her and her brother trying to help them to understand about the war. But I think that's true of so many. That it was true with me and my father. He didn't want to talk about World War II either.
Mm.
We have another question? I see a hand. I see a hand in the back.
Chuck, thank you for your service, first of all.
Thank you.
You said that when you got back to the United States, you developed an anti-war sentiment. I'm going to guess that you actually developed it sooner, and it was when you were in country. Can you define when that was? Was there a magic moment when you suddenly said, this is really messed up?
There was not a magic moment, but there was a pretty clear timetable that I remember. When I left for Vietnam, I was not happy about it, but I didn't object. I mean, I didn't think about resisting. I certainly didn't consider going to Canada or going to Sweden or anything like that. But I assumed that somebody knew a lot more than I did about what was happening in Vietnam. President Johnson and the Congress, and there was a reason why we needed to, you know, stop the Vietnamese in Vietnam before they swam ashore in California. So I was sort of ready to go along with it, despite the fact that it was not a happy moment. But after I landed in Saigon and was assigned to my unit, which was, as George said, the 519th Military Intelligence Battalion, and we settled into routine, which in my case was doing a lot of analysis and reports about what the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were doing or likely to do. I was really lucky to be assigned to military intelligence because it gave me not only the opportunity, but it was a work requirement to learn as much as I could about what was going on. So we pored over captured documents and materials, but we also had access to books, magazines, newspapers, and because most of the guys in my unit had at least some college, university training, and there were some graduates too, we talked a lot and we passed things around. So we all were involved in this sort of cyclical learning experience and sharing a lot. And gradually, I became very disillusioned about what we were doing. And And I had a few Vietnamese friends, not many, but some guys didn't have any. There seemed to be a barrier between us and these were South Vietnamese allies, Army of Republic of Vietnam, ARVN troops who we were supposed to be working with closely, but in fact we did not. But I made it a point to become friends with some of them, and, and everything that I was seeing was contrary to what the U.S. government had been saying and what the media was reporting about the war in Vietnam. And I began to have very, very serious doubts about the whole scheme. And within about, and that was after about 3 months, 3 or 4 months. And by the time the Tet Offensive came, which also had an impact on all of our thinking, that was when the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong basically attacked every major city and town in the South during the Tet holiday. When that happened, that really had a profound impact on the American people back home, because it showed that we were not approaching the light at the end of the tunnel, that we were winning. People realized that was just bogus. But in my case, it came with the witnessing and being underneath this massive bombardment that occurred in Saigon. And luckily, my unit, my compound that was on the banks of the Saigon River, was never hit. And that's because of the skill of the American pilots who were driving the helicopters and the fighter jets. But all around us, everything was completely destroyed. And what had been a nice, pleasant neighborhood of Vietnamese families with the kids playing soccer in the street and the chickens clucking around and old men smoking their pipes, that was gone. There was nothing but rubble left. And so all of that really disillusioned me and so many of my friends. And during that period, I was just confused and angry. And when I left Vietnam in June of '68, I could not know it at the time, but I was actually very lucky, because having enlisted in the Army, I had a 3-year obligation. If I'd been drafted, I would have only had 2 years. But I made the stupid mistake of listening to the recruiter who promised me that I would not have to go to Vietnam if I signed up for 3 years. So I signed up for 3 years and I went straight to Vietnam. But, so I still had 1 year to go, and I was very unhappy about that. I wanted to be out of the Army, and I just wanted to go home and resume my life. However, my last year in the Army I was assigned to Germany, to U.S. Army Headquarters Europe in Heidelberg. And Heidelberg, Germany is a beautiful, beautiful town. And the university is there, and it was a time of peace. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I mean, here I was out of Vietnam, and I was in Heidelberg, Germany. And I had a year in a very comfortable assignment, again, working on reports. But this time we were working on reports about the Russians and the Czechs and the Hungarians. And it was all quite interesting. And during that year, I reflected on my experience in Vietnam and what I had learned, what I had concluded. And I got past my anger and my disillusionment, my confusion, and I decided that I was going to go back to the U.S., go back to the University of Georgia, somehow get involved in the anti-war movement. And I had no idea what that might be, no idea, but that's what I was going to do. And that sort of commitment, that sort of saved my life. I mean, that gave me a purpose in life and a way to deal with that, that really the most profound experience of my lifetime up to then. And so when I came back to the University of Georgia, it took a little time for me to get my feet back on the ground, but it happened. I did get involved in the anti-war movement, and we formed, I'll tell you this and then I'll keep quiet for a minute, but during that time, there were some anti-war activities at the University of Georgia, but they were not very pronounced. And there was a guy in one of my classes, a nice young guy, who was part of one of this anti-war group and I think they consisted of about 6 people. And he said to me one day, tomorrow night we're having a candlelight service at the library out on the ground, on the lawn, out of respect for the people who've been killed in Vietnam, and Americans and Vietnamese. He said, would you be willing to speak? He said, you're the only Vietnam vet we know. He said, we don't know anybody else who's ever been in Vietnam. And I said, maybe. Let me think about it. I'll tell you tomorrow. So the next day I told him I'd do it. And I had scratched out some notes on a yellow pad. Basically what I just told you about arriving in Vietnam, not really understanding what was going on, and then gradually becoming opposed to the war. And at the end of that speech, all of these people came down to the stage and wanted to stay in touch and let's do something, what can we do? But out of that group came 9 veterans, Vietnam vets, who were all back on campus. None of us knew each other. We didn't know we were there. And so the next morning we got together at a cafe in Athens and had a cup of coffee and decided to form a chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So we took a pretty conventional and low-key approach. We spoke to Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs and PTAs and classrooms and church groups, anybody who would listen to us. And people were generally respectful. I mean, the fact that we'd been in Vietnam, I guess, was enough to give them a pause. And we did radio and TV interviews. And in fact, one time my parents saw me on TV, and they were not very happy about that. And that's what prompted my father to say, "What happened to you? They turn you into a communist over there, or what?" But then and a couple of years later, my parents and I didn't have any contact for a while. We were very much estranged. And one day my father called me on the phone, and I was in Athens. They had, by this time, they'd moved to Columbia, South Carolina. And my father said, "Chuck, I'm just passing through town. I wonder, do you have time for a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Yes, sir." So we got together at a Waffle House and had a long discussion about the weather. And then finally he said, "Well, your mother and I have been talking. We have decided that this war is a terrible thing and it's got to stop. We're going to do what we can." And he said, "But we think you were right and we were wrong." And he said, "We would like for you to come back home." And it was one of those moments I'll never forget in my life. You know, it's just one of those situations that a lot of American families went through. But later, as I continued my various activities and different jobs and had some pretty interesting experiences, there was not a day that went by that I didn't think about Vietnam. And I had a desire to go back to Vietnam, to somehow see a country hopefully at peace now. And the opportunity came in 1995, which is when I went and began to work there. And but it was a process that began when I arrived in Vietnam in 1967. And I thought with the end of the war in 1975, all of that would sort of evaporate and I would go back to normal and I wouldn't be dealing with Vietnam anymore. But it stayed with me. And when I went in 1995 for this humanitarian project sponsored by the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, again, I made a 3-year commitment. That was it. Then I'd come back to Athens, Georgia and sit on my front porch, I assumed. But 3 years led to 5 years, and 5 to 10, and now 27, 28. I've lost track. I'm still there anyway, still doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is there another audience question? Okay. So, Bo, let's go over here first, and then in the back. Thank you.
This isn't really a question, but I just want to say it, and maybe you can speak to it. I've read many times that young people, young men especially, the amygdala and the hippocampus doesn't even completely develop until around 26. So you put a young kid, babies like you're talking about, in a war situation, it can be damaging for life. And then, you know, I also read there like 22 veterans a day die by suicide. So there's something we've got, I don't know, I don't even know what I'm trying to say or ask, but this is very disturbing to me, and you guys can speak, or you can speak more about it than I ever could.
Well, you've described it.
Yeah.
You've described what is really true, and now it's being recognized by professionals and by the Veterans Administration and the medical establishment. So, and there's some effort, I think, to deal with those things now. There's a more sober look at that than there's ever been.
Well, that was one thing that was so hard for the veterans when they came back. I mean, it was quite a few years before the term PTSD was even invented. And you had a couple of doctors and psychologists who were kind of saying, let's try to make sense of this thing because it's happening to a lot of people. And, you know, it used to be called shell shock. But I want to add one more thing about this. Like I said at the beginning of my remarks, you know, all wars have this process of reckoning, and something that I think is really important to recognize. One of the interesting things about those who survive war is, I can't remember the numbers offhand, I should be able to recall them, but in World War II, well, let's start with the Civil War. If you were gut shot in the Civil War, you're dead. By the time World War II came around, you had a much better chance of survival from a serious injury. By the time Vietnam came around, if you were North Vietnamese, you were probably dead. You know, there were clandestine field hospitals, but you were basically, if you were seriously wounded, you had a sucking chest wound or a gut shot or whatever, you were dead, or an amputee. But with American soldiers in Vietnam, you had really for the first time this phenomenon of massive numbers of people who were medevaced out and got excellent emergency care. And then you fast forward another 40, 50 years. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the medical attention, the sophistication of rehab, you have a generation, and frankly, a largely forgotten generation, all volunteer army. And we say, you know, we thank them for what they did, but, you know, the hospitals and psychiatric and long-term care facilities now, people are now surviving from Iraq and Afghanistan with catastrophic brain injury that would have killed you in Vietnam and every other preceding war. And those guys are out there and they're, you know, surviving, and I think they're largely out of the public mind. And you know, one thing I think is important about this book and what I want to try to do with this book is again to talk about, you know, the specificity of every war, but the universality of the principle, you know, and to talk to Iraq and Afghanistan era veterans about their experience, because I think they relate. I mean, I have quite a few friends who are veterans of Iraq and Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, and they relate to this. They understand what you're talking about, and I think in some cases they feel it's not dissimilar to what a lot of Vietnam veterans felt in the early years, that they were not. No one knew what to do with them. You know, they'd come home and it wasn't like World War II with confetti and parades and brass bands. I mean, they didn't win the war. And there's a dialogue in the book where Bobby Muller, the founder of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the most famous of the anti-war vets, he talks to McGeorge Bundy, Johnson's, what was he, National Security Advisor?
I think so.
And Bundy says to him, yeah, I realize no one wants to deal with you guys. They don't know what to say to you. You know, it was horrible. The government doesn't want to deal with what it did. You're the ones who bore the brunt of it, and no one's going to deal with you. It's too uncomfortable. And I think it's different with Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's not the same sort of level of official dismissal, but it's a public lack of awareness, let's say.
And the middle section of the book really goes into that, goes into how that changed over time and how, the official response and then, of course, the response of the veterans reacted to that as well. I think we have two more questions. I think one over here and one over on the other side.
George, you indicated that it took the U.S. a while to make a connection between Agent Orange and many of the health illnesses that vets experience coming back from the war. And you also implied that for the Vietnamese, there was less of a connection and less help. What should the U.S. have done after they left Vietnam to deal with those kind of maladies and just helping Vietnam kind of recover from that whole war?
That's a really good question. The two questions have different answers, but related answers. I think with American veterans, it took really through the Carter years to really figure out that there were these patterns. It wasn't immediately apparent. Then you have the first generations of birth defects. You have a lot of young men getting very sick. And I think, without being partisan about this, but it was, well, let's not mince words, it was partisan. The Reagan administration came in as this thing was beginning, and it smelled to them like communist propaganda and an attempt to extort money. And in the domestic front, once the focus shifted to Dow Chemical, Monsanto, the big producers, it became a question about corporate liability for harm caused by corporate behavior. And it was a time when the Reagan administration was very aggressively trying to deregulate the chemical industry. It was the early days of environmentalism. There was a lot of new science coming out about the harm caused by chemical production, environmental impacts of industry. And the Reagan administration were very, very determined to stop in their tracks the attempts to regulate those industries. So I think Agent Orange got mixed up in that to some degree. And then I think there was a lot of rhetoric under the Reagan administration that Vietnam had been a noble cause. And a lot of the veterans said, well, in that case, why are you slashing the budgets for the VA? And then it became very, very clear through congressional investigations through the 80s that the ostensible scientific studies that were being financed by the CDC or run through the CDC were actually seeking to prove that there was no problem. It was a cover-up, quite simply. In Vietnam, you were dealing with a level of bitterness and denial. The United States, one of the weird things about this war in comparison to others, after the wars in Germany and Japan, it was the victorious force that determined and dictated how the peace played out. You had the Marshall Plan for Germany, you had the Japanese post-war peace constitution, you had massive investments in rebuilding their economies, their infrastructure. And in Vietnam, it was largely, for a good 25 years, frankly, it was the losers in the war who dictated the post-war sequence. So, for many years, there was no conversation for at least 12 and closer to 15 years. There was no conversation about anything other than find all our MIAs. And that issue became very politicized. And you got all these kind of conspiracy theories that people were being held in secret jails in Laos and whatever. It got to be very ugly. And, the Vietnamese realized in the late 80s that the United States knew that by this hostile tone, it wasn't getting its MIAs back. It wasn't actually productive. And if the goal was to get them back, both sides had an interest in talking about how to do that. The Vietnamese would get a little less pressure if they were more cooperative. Chuck talks a lot about when he first went in the early 90s. and had very direct personal dealings with the politics of the POW-MIA issue. And, you know, so once you got over that, and there was the first stirrings of cooperation, then you could get these very preliminary moves to give the Vietnamese all humanitarian aid, as long as it wasn't tied to directly war-related issues. And once that was underway, it's like, well, we're helping amputees, so what's more logical? And this is where Chuck's story really becomes a huge part of it. You know, if you're worried about people who have their legs blown off, how about getting rid of the bombs that are blowing their legs off? You know, so actually that was less controversial than other things because it was a humanitarian obligation. You couldn't get away from the cause and effect problem. But with Agent Orange, there was always the cause and effect problem. And it was 1991, the American veterans were not required any longer, through some mixture of a bit of science, a bit of politics, a lot of guilt, the fact that they had a political lobby which was pretty influential. You know, the burden of proof was removed from Americans. But for years, those feelings about corporate liability, about propaganda, those continued for over another decade toward the Vietnamese. And meanwhile, you had generations of Vietnamese who were dying, and generations of Vietnamese kids being born with horrific deformities. But, you know, we both know pretty well the ambassador who was there from 2014 to 2017, Ted Osius, who was very influential in a lot of really the big humanitarian breakthroughs of recent years. And he was a young political officer when they first opened, before there was an embassy, the American government presence in Hanoi. And then he became a regional health and environment specialist in Southeast Asia for the State Department. And he would go to conferences in 2001, 2002, you know, where he was literally forbidden to speak the words Agent Orange as a matter of official policy. And if the Vietnamese brought it up in the meeting, it couldn't be reflected in the minutes. So there's, I don't know, I mean, it's a lot of things, but I think a lot of psychological denial that they just couldn't go there. Not just the Reagan administration, I mean, American officialdom in general just could not deal with this in the case of Vietnam. It was too big an admission to make.
We have one more question in the back there. And Chuck, if you want to go ahead and add as Bo walks over there.
I was just going to add to what George said, but the other flip side of that coin is the fact that when we get discouraged about our small efforts to make changes and we think it's just nothing's going to happen, it's no good, it's just not, there's going to be no impact whatsoever. If you look back over that period that George was just describing, the truth is that in small and incremental ways, veterans and concerned citizens and doctors and anybody who had some knowledge of Agent Orange actually made progress. I mean, the pressure never let up. And when it seemed like there was no hope, then suddenly a ray of light would shine in and somebody would get on board. And there were congressional delegations that came in and they got hammered by us, by the general community. What about Agent Orange? And at the same time, the Vietnamese government, which appeared to be often cowed by the U.S., just by this immense pressure, in fact, they were also doing a lot of things to change the situation. I mean, they were told in no uncertain terms that at this next meeting we're having, do not bring up Agent Orange. Don't put that on the table. If you put that on the table, we're going to leave the meeting. And so, to some extent, they were faced down by us, but at the same time, they were putting their own pressure where they could on us. And I remember they told me that we, government officials, are under tremendous pressure. We go into these villages, and the local people are saying, what are you doing about this Agent Orange problem that we hear about it? It's in the newspapers here and there, but you're not pushing the U.S. government. So it sort of strengthened them, their hand. And people like, there's a book that just came out around release date around the same time as George's, and I don't know the name of it, I'm sorry, but the woman who wrote it is Diane Fox, who is a friend of a lot of us in Vietnam, who has done a lot of research, did a PhD, and looked at Agent Orange very systematically, and went village to village and household to household and interviewed a huge number of Vietnamese. And she said the thing that struck her the most and that really saddened her was that so many times these families, they would open up to her and explain what their circumstances were with 3 severely disabled children who couldn't do anything but scream all day. But they would describe their situations, and then they would thank her for having come, because they said they'd waited for years for somebody to show some interest in them. And this was the first time anyone from the U.S. Embassy, from the American government, had come to see them. And Diane said, I'm not from the American government. I'm not from the U.S. Embassy. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm doing research. They didn't get it. As far as they were concerned, she was from the U.S. Embassy and she was representing the American government. And they were thankful to her for showing that interest. They said, nobody has shown this before.
Yeah, I was just curious on the Vietnamese victim side, what involvement, if any, has Dow Chemical provided, either in terms of funding scientific research that's objective or compensating the victims?
As far as I'm aware, they haven't. Have you heard that? No, there was an out-of-court settlement for American veterans way back. There are corporations. I mean, the notable one, I am not aware of anything that Dow or Monsanto has done. I don't want to malign them because it's possible, but I've certainly never heard of it. But one interesting thing, when I talked about how in this particular place that we started with, the Ashaw Valley, just to go back to the geography here, along the Lao border, and I said that the essence of understanding a lot of this humanitarian work is that it should be non-partisan. In the Ashaw Valley, if you see the words where it's actually highlighted, you'll see Hamburger Hill arrowed where the border comes around next to Tua Tien. The Boeing Corporation, which manufactured the B-52, which probably did more physical destruction to Vietnam than any other, has a program with Vietnam Veterans of America for kindergartens. This is where my Trump friend, airborne guy, and our friend David, the ex-Marine, are doing their program to take bicycles to the ethnic minority villagers. You know, Boeing has invested quite a lot of money. They're working also in that valley with a conservative evangelical group from South Carolina called Vets with a Mission. So there's surprising things going on. And I think, you know, your experience in the early days in Hanoi in the 90s was you got a lot of support from, I mean, no doubt with a good amount of cajoling and pushing, but Ford Motor Company and Motorola and these corporations, because you were on the American Chamber of Commerce board. And
yeah. However, to go back specifically to your question, this is kind of a stretch to offer any beneficial interpretation of this, but I think it was in 1968, Dow Chemical realized in their product manufacturing of Agent Orange that the levels of toxicity were increased, and the danger and the damage that could be done by Agent Orange was enhanced if this material was cooked at high temperatures and if the process was speeded up. It became much more volatile and much more dangerous. And so they called a meeting. I may get some of this wrong, George, but you can correct me. But they called a meeting at their headquarters in Michigan, and all these executives flew in from Monsanto and Diamond Shamrock and other companies that were making Agent Orange under government contract. And Dow Chemical said, these are our findings. We suggest that all of us back up, reduce the speed of manufacture and reduce the cooking time, the cooking temperatures, and it'll reduce the toxicity of this stuff because it's really much more dangerous than we realized. And all the other manufacturers said, to hell with you, we're going to make money out of this. We've got a government contract. The more of this we make, the more money we make, and you know, what was the point of this meeting? Goodbye.
Yeah. And the Pentagon at that, I mean, this particular period, you know, if you look at the use of Agent Orange, and don't forget there were others too, there was blue, white, purple, green, pink, there were a lot of, we called them the rainbow chemicals. Agent Purple, which was used early in the war, was much more toxic than Agent Orange. But the use chart, the graph kind of goes like that. 66, 67, 68, plateaus, 69. And the Pentagon were putting such intense production demands on to ramp up the volume that was being sprayed. They were getting up to 4.5 million gallons a year at that point. And yeah, the profits these companies were making were huge. And Dow Chemical, I think Chuck's right. They do deserve a certain amount of credit, and they always prided themselves that the concentrations of dioxin, which was a trace element, you know, they knew dioxin was toxic from the beginning, but in the quantities in which it naturally occurred in the production process, it was really a minuscule trace amount. But it was the acceleration of the production that caused the problem, and they did try to keep them lower. And there have been scientific samplings of different batches that I think substantiate that Dow's were not as dirty as many of the others.